You're about to listen to the Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders, for coders, about all aspects of life as a developer.
I'm Will, the curmudgeonly experienced developer.
And I'm Beej, the optimistic newbie developer. If you're in the Middle Tennessee area or will be traveling through here in early June, come out and meet us and Saran from the Code Newbie podcast as we launch Code Newbie Nashville, a local meetup for the most supportive community of programmers and people learning to code. Code Newbie has meetups in Atlanta, Austin, Dallas, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and now Nashville, Tennessee. For details about the meetup or future meetups, go to www.completedeveloperpodcast.com/CodeNewbieNashville or follow the link in the show notes. Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast. This week we are going to be talking about a life lesson, improving your listening skills. And I have a quote to kind of start the podcast off. Listening is the ability to accurately receive and interpret messages in the communication process. And that comes from SkillsYouNeed.com. Most of the outline that I wrote came from them, and I really recommend taking a look at their site. They have a lot of great information there. Today we're going to talk about why you need to improve your listening skills, how to improve your listening skills, what it takes to become an active listener, and finally, some hindrances to effective listening. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
I have been fighting partition purgatory on Windows. My laptop, which is right in front of me right now, I want to move it over to Linux Mint because my desktop, that worked.
Yeah.
It worked smooth too. And this laptop has got a 480 gig hard drive in it, and Windows is installed there. It's using like 120 gigs tops for everything. So I'm like, oh, I can shrink the partition down, right? That's what a reasonable person would think. Windows will not let me do it through their tool chain. Like I'm going to have to get in there with, and we'll have to get a Linux boot disk and actually, do it that way. I spent several hours just trying to get it to work within Windows with the assumption that, hey, they're not going to script the file system. And I don't know how much the Linux folks care about screwing up my, I want it to be the people that have a vested interest in making the thing stable to be the ones doing it if possible. But Windows just will not let me do it. It's just taking up the whole hard drive and there's no reason for it.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll give me like 40 gigs, which is great, except I need more than that.
When I installed Ubuntu, it took from Windows. I put about 300.
Yeah. And I may just pop the Linux Mint disk in and see.
Yeah, I think that would probably be your best bet.
Because I am pretty strongly pushing towards switching out to Linux with everything .NET is doing with switching .NET Core over. My software that I actually require to get through my day is getting very, very open. Most things will work on Linux. So like now I'm down to Visual Studio, SQL Server, Management Studio, and Evernote are like the three apps. Well, I can use VS Code on Linux. I can use Postgres for my database for, all my stuff that isn't stuck on SQL. I'll still have to have a Linux VM or a Windows VM, but I can get away from it. And then Evernote is turning into a smoldering dumpster fire anyway. They've tried to make an app that works for everybody for everything, and it pretty much doesn't really work very well anymore. And I've found some apps to do everything I need from that. Of course, now I have like 5 or 6 years of notes in there that I've got to somehow figure out how I'm going to move.
There should be some way to port those.
Well, there's an API.
Okay.
And so it's probably going to be console app time. So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's, things are kind of easy at the moment. I'm sure they'll get harder soon, but how about you?
Well, speaking of Linux, I looked up the pronunciation of Arch or Arch Linux.
Yep.
I don't know if that episode is going to come out the week before or 2 weeks before this one, but we recorded it last week, and there is a lot of debate in the Linux community, from what I found, on the actual pronunciation of the name. There doesn't seem to be a standard pronunciation.
Lovely.
Just got back a few hours ago from Florida. Went down to visit my sister. Spent the weekend helping her and her family move into an awesome new home. They have a little over 5 acres that's mostly flat, grassy land. There's some trees, but just perfect for my nieces to play on. They have a saltwater pool, which I know my brother-in-law really wanted a pool, so now they have one, and it's really great. I am actually going to be helping them to install IoT devices to make their new home a smart home, because they've already got plans to renovate the home.
Nice.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I'll talk about that a little bit next week. With what I'm starting off with is the speakers they have out by the pool. Like the home came with 2 outdoor Bose speakers, but they weren't connected to anything. The guy had taken everything else when he moved out. And
he left the Bose speakers behind?
Yeah.
Wow. Everything else must have been real expensive then.
So, and they're older speakers, but my sister was asking me, she's like, hey, how can we get these to work? You know, what do we need to do? And after looking at them, I thought, I could add some Bluetooth connections to them so they could play music from their phones, or they're wanting to put a TV out there.
That would be pretty cool. Like a sealed TV.
Yeah, sealed TV for watching sporting events and stuff out by the pool. And
that's pretty cool.
There's like a patio and then a pool, and so it's really nice. So it's a really cool setup. Yeah, and then that, and I found a solution to what we talked about earlier about getting apps published in the iTunes App Store. My sister gave me her old MacBook.
That's one way to handle it.
Yep. I asked her because I saw a Mac laying on the ground when I got there, and it's
just like living wild or what?
Yeah, just a wild,
just a wild Macintosh.
Yeah. No, it belonged.
Did it come with the black turtleneck and the square glasses?
Yes, exactly. No, the one that was laying on the ground belonged to my brother-in-law's younger brother. He was there helping move, but he is about to go to chiropractic school and is doing an internship with my brother-in-law, who is a chiropractor. They actually give you credit for doing an internship before you come to school.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's really neat. Anyways, so I asked her if it was hers, and she's like, oh, no, that's Cooper's. And I said, oh, well, I explained why I was asking. And she's like, oh, well, I don't use my MacBook anymore. Do you want it? I said, yes.
That's handy.
Yeah.
Because you could probably, depending on how old it is, it may work better than that laptop you have for a lot of things, like Node especially.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. I mean, it is kind of older, and I do need to go to the Apple store tomorrow and get a new power supply because she lost the power supply to it. But I'm like,
yeah, that's
still a really great.
Yeah, that'd be a good deal for you.
So, with that said, let's roll the music and get on into some cool IoTs. This week for IoTs, I have a little update on Project Valkyrie, or as we're calling it around here, Complete Developer in Space. We have the parts list put together, and that will be in the show notes. We just have to make sure we get all the parts and start assembling them. Most of the equipment we're going to get from Amazon.com. It looks like the launch date is going to be pushed back closer to spring of next year, just to give us enough time to test the equipment. I want to make sure that the parachutes deploy appropriately before we send it up.
Yeah. Well, it's that, and
we have to get the permissions to launch. I want to make sure that, that the FAA is okay with us launching.
Yeah, and I think the regulatory environment is moving around a little bit too.
Yeah. So we also have a potential location. My brother-in-law's grandparents have a place in southern Georgia, below Atlanta, to me, everything below
Cartersville
Atlanta.
or not Cartersville.
Cartersville's above Atlanta.
Yeah, Cartersville's above. I'm trying to think. Like McDonough is above. I'm trying to remember what's south of Atlanta now.
Well, Macon is, and this is below Macon.
Okay.
But they have about 25 acres with a lot of open space and flat land. So we're thinking that is going to be our launch site. My brother-in-law said...
Of course, if there's one tree out there, that's the one it'll land in.
Yeah, of course. He's saying that he doesn't think that'll be any problem, that most likely his family will think it's a really fun idea and be on board. So
yeah. Well, we can bring barbecue.
Yes. And it'll be fun. It'll be a good time. Before we really roll into things, though, we have another fun announcement. We're trying to get our iTunes reviews up.
Yeah, because this show has grown. Well, it's grown organically without really us taking a whole lot of effort on the marketing side of things, because we've been working on audio quality and working on content, working on our process and everything else. Like, there's been some marketing, but we haven't like completely opened the floodgates on it.
Yeah.
And one of the big things that we really need to start doing is getting reviews in iTunes so people can actually find us.
Yes. And so starting next week, we will be reading reviews that we have. And if we read your review on iTunes, we will send you some complete developer swag. Maybe rubber ducky, or
we might even send them a shirt. I mean,
or a t-shirt. I mean, we're still in the process of figuring that out. We'll announce that next week when we read our first review. But go on iTunes, give us a review, and if we read it on the show, we'll send you some cool stuff. So to start our episode off, I have another quote. This one is from the International Listening Association, and it is: listening, the process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken and or nonverbal messages. So why do we need to improve our listening skills?
Because we have to communicate with other people, and they have to communicate with us for us to know what's actually happening. A lot of times,
listening is one of the most important skills you can have. How well you listen has a major impact on your job effectiveness and on the quality of your relationships with others. And that's another quote from this one from Mind Tools.
Yeah, and it's important to note here that listening is not the same thing as hearing. Anybody that has been in a serious relationship that has gone really south in a hurry will realize that at some level. Hearing is basically taking in the racket that's going on around you. It's the sounds, somebody speaking with the background noise and all that. Whereas listening is actually requiring focus and paying attention to not only what the person is saying, but how they're saying it. In other words, other than the noises being made, like how they're holding their body, how their tonality, their inflection, all those sort of things that are most of the meaning. So there's several reasons why you have to be able to listen well. And among those are obtaining information from other people or from various sources, understanding what's going on. In other words, to get the back and forth where you can ask questions and get an answer and then ask a question based on that answer. Enjoyment.
Yeah, I know you and I both like talking and listening. Yeah. We like having a conversation, and that involves the listening aspect is key to that.
Yeah. Well, and it's honestly, it's amazing how much stuff you miss when you're not actually listening to the world you live in, even outside of people. Mm-hmm. Like I know so many people that can walk through the woods and they never hear anything.
Yeah. Then also, you guys, our audience, you're listening to enjoy because for some reason you enjoy listening to us, and you may learn something because every now and then we have the random pearls of wisdom.
Yeah, exactly. A blind pig finds an acorn every so often.
Yeah. Listening can also increase your employability.
Yeah, and this is huge, especially with interviews.
Yes.
Something I've noticed, because that, like, the questions that people ask you in an interview, if you think that the goal of that question is to get you to answer, you're missing the point. The point is to get you to ask another question.
Yes, I can agree with that. Richard Branson has attributed his success to his ability to listen.
Yeah.
And a lot of employers even provide listening skills training.
Yeah, they have. I mean, they have a pretty good reason to, don't they? I mean, if the employees aren't really paying attention to what's going on, that kind of ends badly.
Mm-hmm. And then it can also improve your personal life. Definitely can increase the quality and even the number of your friendships and improve your self-esteem and your confidence, because if you're listening and really paying attention to not just what is said, but how it's said and the nonverbals as
you can
well.
actually find out what's going on, and you don't feel like a knife is coming in the dark.
Yes.
Effectively.
Yes, exactly.
So I guess we need to talk about how to improve listening skills, and probably the first one, which is what we just demonstrated, as we always do, is stop talking and prepare to listen, which I just talked over you.
Yes. If we were supposed to talk more than we listen, we would have 2 tongues and 1 ear, and we'd look really strange. That last part was me, but the rest of it was Mark Twain.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, like if you look at the human head, how many sensory organs do you have on there versus how many organs do you have for transmitting information? Your head's basically a receiver.
Yes. So what you want to do is to remove distractions to the best of your ability. Now, there's going to be times where you're not able to remove all the distractions.
Well, and a lot of that too, a lot of distractions are distractions because you let them distract you. I mean, there's some things like you can't process because, you can't hear somebody talk, but it's another thing when somebody's talking and there's somebody moving behind them and you're paying more attention to the movement than you are to the audio.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to, going right along with that, you want to focus on the speaker. Focus on not just what they're saying and hearing it, but pay attention to them, to their body movements, their body language. You can tell when someone is excited about something, even if their tone doesn't show it.
Yeah.
You can see it in their facial expressions or the way their hands move. Like Will can tell you when I get excited talking about something,
I worry about equipment getting broken.
Yes,
because there's not a lot of room in here.
Yes, and my hands go.
He gets the roving jazz hands of doom. Smacks the microphone, and it's like, oh, somebody's gonna have to cut that out of the audio.
That happened to us the other week
when you were talking about motorcycles.
Yes, it did.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of funny to watch. And the other thing you can pick up on is things that people are not excited about or they're unhappy about.
Yes,
and you can watch for tension. I know my office mate. He who shall not be named. When he gets mad, his jawline will tense up, and that may be the only thing you ever see.
Yeah,
but you can tell, hey, he's irritated because he's about to give himself TMJ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen him do that before too.
Yeah.
The other thing is put other thoughts out of your mind.
Yeah, and this is something that I run across a lot with people, and I mean this is something that they'll tell you when they're talking about listening skills is a sizable percentage of the population listens with the intent of responding, not the intent of understanding.
Yeah.
And that's probably in a quote further down.
Yeah, that's actually the next point, which is seek to understand before seeking to be understood. And just like Will was saying, a lot of people, when they're having a conversation, they're not paying attention to what the other person is saying, especially if it's like a debate. When this episode comes out, we'll still be in the presidential debates and stuff, and watch it because they're not paying attention to what the other.
Yeah, and by the way, whoever your candidate is awful.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what you say, right? Like that's the tone that it's carrying, and what do you notice about that? The rancor goes up on both sides.
Yeah, and it's not. Let's discuss this and I'll listen to what you have to say and then you listen to what I have to say. It's you're saying something and the whole time I'm thinking about how can I argue that point or preparing my next statement, not listening to what you say and comprehending it.
Right. Which is honestly the best way to actually come up with a retort that works.
Yeah. So if you're seeking to understand, your modus operandi will be to listen. Also, use silence to your advantage.
Yeah, because there's when somebody cannot predict what you're going to say because you hadn't said it yet, they have to wait. Now, one thing that you'll also notice is right now you just looked at me because I stopped talking because you had to wait. I put you in a position by doing that you're trying to figure out what's he about to say. Okay. When I pause like that, it forces people to look. That's something that people that speak slowly do a lot of times. And the reason is because that's a pause where I can wait to make sure you're still paying attention. And it forces you to respond to me, which puts you in a frame of mind where you're more likely to listen.
And the other point under here too is collect information before disseminating it. That's the whole point here. Is the point of listening is to gather information. And the more information you can gather, the better informed you are, so that when you do speak and you do disseminate that information, you're more likely to be accurate and more likely to have people listen to you because you've listened to them.
Right. Well, and even if you're a complete sociopath, right, if you have more information, you can choose what you disseminate. Whereas if you have little information, that's what you have.
Exactly.
So there's really no downside of this, even if you're a complete, total sociopath. Whereas if you're a decent human being, there's still no downside.
Next, you want to put the speaker at ease. And you can do this by facing the speaker, maintain eye contact. And by that, I don't mean stare them down.
And can we jump to the side here for a second? Because I know a lot of programmers have some difficulty with eye contact. A programmer in a friend of mine's understanding is someone who is intensely interested in their shoes when they're talking to you. But if you can't look somebody in the eye, you don't have to. Look between their eyes. Slightly above, like right between their eyebrows, they can't tell. You'll still look. Yeah. Now don't like do like the creepo stare for like a minute, but you can use this to your advantage. Even if you're a little bit shy, this will work.
Yeah. And the thing about looking at them and facing them and maintaining eye contact is you are showing interest in what they're saying, but you're also able to read their facial expressions and see what they're saying, versus
hear what they're saying.
Yes, exactly. And
which are two different things.
They really are. They really are. And be patient. Avoid personal prejudice. This is an important one here because we all have our own opinions.
Yeah.
And even if you think, completely disagree, you don't have to say it and you don't have to stop the person, because I can say from personal experience, I have learned things from people I completely disagreed with on what they were saying, but they were providing information for me that I didn't know.
Yeah.
I still disagreed with them at the end of it.
Well, and sometimes it tempers your opinion.
Yes.
Too. And, sometimes it hardens your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's no reason to throw that data away if you're getting it for free. Now, I mean, if they're being insulting, yeah, but otherwise,
well, yeah,
like take input, don't take attack.
And I do want to point something out here. These are all things that you can do in one-on-one conversations. You can do in a group conversation, or you can do if you are a audience member at a lecture or something, or a workshop.
Yeah. And, I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and a bunch of us all went out to lunch. And it was a bunch of, small business owners and people that are trying to be. And some of the spouses were there. And most of the spouses interacted, and they would turn and they'd talk to somebody and, face to face. It was great. But there was one guy whose wife was on her cell phone playing, I think it was either Pet Rescue or it was one of those, Angry Birds, one of those kind of games. And that's all she was doing. She was looking down. She, She wasn't listening to anybody. And
soon she'll be playing one of my apps.
Yeah. Well, everybody kind of got the impression that, this gal was rude. Later on in the event, the people that had been at that lunch, I never saw any of them around her ever again because they got an impression. And, maybe she was just having a bad day and they needed to put their prejudice aside. But on the other hand, the fact that she didn't listen engendered prejudice.
That's true. And kind of going along with this, empathize by putting yourself in the other person's shoes, either the speaker or the other person you're having a conversation with. Even if you disagree with them, think about, okay, they came to this conclusion
because
for a reason. How did they get here?
Yeah, and assume that they are a decent human being. Like, it's the worst thing in the world to look at somebody and go, oh, they have an opinion I disagree with. It's because they're racist, sexist, homophobe, lazy, communist, moral degenerate, and
many
French,
other things we cannot,
or something.
Okay.
I don't know, but if you're putting them in a box and you're saying they have this opinion because they're in this box, that probably is not accurate. And you also, it comes out in your body language. Like, it's impossible to act well enough to fake that. Like, actors actually have to get into their character and believe to some degree what the character's doing to do their job well. You have to do the same.
That's why, was it Jodie Foster wasn't in the Silence of the Lambs sequel, was because Anthony Hopkins got so well into character that it terrified her.
Yeah.
And she refused to make the sequel with him.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at Heath Ledger.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he was the Joker.
Mm-hmm.
And he nailed that role at substantial personal cost, at final personal cost. And to some degree, you do have to be an actor when you're dealing with other people. You have to give them the benefit of the doubt, even if you're going to suspend that benefit later, just so that you can interact.
And finally, wait and watch for nonverbal communication. Another quote I have from the Skills You Need: effective listening involves observing body language and noticing inconsistencies between verbal and nonverbal messages. And we touched on this a little bit earlier too, when Will was talking about he who shall not be named. Sometimes the only way he knows that he's angry is by seeing his jawline tighten up.
Yeah.
Because you won't hear it in his voice or in what he says.
You'll hear him breathe a little heavier too, but...
Well, yeah.
And it changes his gait. I've been around him a lot. But yeah, like it's all very subtle. And it's, what's really sad is when you see somebody say that they're really happy about something and they're smiling and it never touches their eyes.
Yes.
And once you start noticing that, you start to see a whole lot of...
it's like teaching someone about kerning.
Yeah, font kerning. Yeah. So it's something you never unsee. But I mean, really, it gives you a much better guide to what's actually going on versus what people would like to have going on.
Yeah. When you're listening, wait for a pause to ask for clarification, especially if it's a role where you're part of a group that's listening to a speaker or something. But even in one-on-one communication, this is helpful. Effective use of silence, as we talked about earlier. And the big point is, do not interrupt unless absolutely necessary.
And I have a coworker,
like Will's doing right now to me.
Yeah. Oh, very clever.
We do it to each other all the time, but that's...
Well, we get excited.
Yeah.
But I've got a coworker that does this every meeting that we ever have, and he'll talk over whoever's already talking. And it drags the meetings out. And even if he's right, he ticks off everybody in the room. And it's not he who shall not be named. It's one of the other guys. He does that, and he just gets excited. And it's not personal or intentional, like it's a personality quirk, but it's hard to recover from.
I can understand that because this is something that I have to focus on, because when I get excited about something, I really just want to get it out and say it. And it's something that I personally have to watch out for. Oh
yeah. And I do too. And that's why we kind of talk over each other. We've gotten better about it because it really sucks having to edit that audio. Or sucks for you. It's not really my problem, but I hear about it anyway.
Yes.
And it's just, it's kind of bad form. And
it makes it easier on you as the listener to understand us when we don't talk over each other.
Yeah.
And ask questions only to ensure understanding, because questions can lead people off topic.
Or they can just lead to answers.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty common fixture in a lot of meetings, is the guy that asks so many questions that the meeting completely runs off the rails.
Yeah. I'm very bad about this. I can get a group off topic so easily, and not on purpose. It's just
And man, when you do it on purpose, it's wild.
Oh yeah. Well, when I do it on purpose,
yeah, I was gonna say I've seen you do it on purpose a few times too. Let's be honest here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but in general, I don't do it on purpose because what happens is what's being said will make me think of a question that relates to the topic, that leads to another question that loosely relates, that leads to another question, and it kind of becomes an afternoon of playing on Wikipedia.
Yeah. Where all of a sudden you look up and you're like, okay, I'm learning about particle physics, and I came here to figure out who the premier of Kazakhstan was. How did this happen?
Usually it goes the opposite way for me because but
it's like here's an obscure topic, that's completely unrelated, and somehow we bridge the gap. And that's what asking too many questions of the wrong sort will do.
I will say on the topic of Wikipedia following rabbit trails, I used to have a job where I was pretty much there to answer the phone, and when I was working at the psych hospital in the registration office, and so whenever someone would come in to be admitted to the psych hospital, I was working hard. But out of a 12-hour shift, that might have been 4 of those 12 hours. The rest of the time, I just had to be there because we never knew when someone was going to come in.
Right.
And so...
You're saying psychiatric patients are unpredictable?
Not so much that psychiatric patients are unpredictable. It's just you never know how long social services is going to take to get everything together. After I finished my homework, because I was in grad school at the time, I would sit and do that on Wikipedia, and I would be all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's fun. You learn all sorts of random stuff doing that.
But it's terrible for a meeting or for any kind of conversation because it mostly just...
Oh, yeah. It's great for... playing around yourself and just learning random stuff because you've got nothing else to do, but you have to be there. But like you said, for getting stuff done, that's terrible. It just
doesn't work.
No.
Another thing is that, if you do start a set of questions that leads the topic astray, try to rein that in. Go, hey, look, we're getting kind of off topic. Let's take this off the side. I had to do this during a phone call last night because there were 4 of us and 2 of us got really animated about something. It was about problems with ORMs, actually.
Yeah.
So the guy had written one, and so we just jumped way off topic. And I'm like, hey, we've gone so far off topic. Let's do this offline. And it's the same thing because I realized, hey, I'm screwing up these other 2 people's time, and that's just not very courteous. So that will help you a little bit. Obviously, it's better to avoid the situation, and
this is something that you and I are both good at, especially with each other, is reining the other in. Of course, we've got 15, 16 years of practice knowing each other and having these types of conversations. But it's a thing that you learn with time, is to be able to recognize, hey, I'm leading the conversation off topic, and it's not only wasting my time, but it's wasting a lot of other people's time too. And being able to bring that back and go, all right, let's get back on topic, and me and the other person can talk about this later. We'll go out to lunch or something.
Yeah. And the next thing is to listen to the words that the people are using and try to actually picture what they're saying. Instead of just hearing the words and letting them crash into you like waves, like actually let them in when they're describing something. And that will make you a better listener. It will change your posture. It'll change the way that you are looking at someone. And so, it appears that you're a better listener, and it makes you a better listener. It makes the things that they are saying actually stick.
And this goes right along with what we said earlier about empathizing and putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Another quote that I have from the Skills You Need, and like I said, it's a great site, you really should check it out, is a good listener will listen not only to what is being said, but also to what is left unsaid or only partially said.
Yeah.
And you get this by doing that, by picturing what the person is saying, especially if they're conveying a story or an example. I know a lot of times Will tells great example stories, and I do when he's telling one of those, I try to picture it in my head because it helps me remember it, especially when it comes to really abstract concepts in coding.
Yeah,
because then I see that that concept comes up and the image from his story pops in my head. But I'm a very visual learner, so that makes sense for me. Hey, coders! I just wanted to break in here to remind you that our friend Bethany Adams has published her first book titled Soulbound, and it is available for purchase on Amazon or through the link in the show notes. If you'd like the chance to win an autographed copy of the book, leave us a review on iTunes or go to www.completedeveloperpodcast.com/iTunes. We'll be drawing the winner the first week of July.
So let's talk about being an active listener. Here's a quote from Mind Tools. Be aware that active listening can give others the impression that you agree with them even if you don't. It's also important to avoid using active listening as a checklist of actions to follow rather than really listening. And what we mean by active listening is, things like positive reinforcement. Going, yeah, I agree. Well, use it sparingly so that you don't distract the person talking. And be willing to elaborate and explain why you're agreeing with a certain point. Like
this is interesting because Will and I just had this conversation. First off, this episode is a re-record. We had recorded it on our old equipment and we're re-recording it on the new equipment. But in the between time, something that we had noticed was he does better at tricks of the trade when I'm not in the room. Because when I'm in the room, I am, yeah.
And I'm waiting to elicit that feedback too.
And I cut a lot of that out when I do the editing, but
that's a place we didn't really want agreement. Like we have a thing we're talking about and that's the thing. It's not the back and forth.
Yeah.
To actually have the effective conversation, you do want that positive feedback to a limited degree.
Mm-hmm.
And the next item is remembering. Here's another quote from SkillsYouNeed. You wore that website out, I guess.
I told you it was a great site.
Yeah. The human mind is notoriously bad at remembering details, especially for any length of time. So, the idea here is to try to remember key points, and the details, ideas, and concepts that someone's talking about, not necessarily specifically how they worded, but the shape of the idea, including the body language that was used to describe it.
Or like an outline of what they said.
Yeah.
A great thing to do here is in longer conversations or in meetings, take notes.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this in our episode on effective meetings, is taking notes. We talked about several different ways of taking notes, which I prefer more of the outline format, whereas Will prefers more of a mind map.
Yeah,
format.
Either a mind map or a list for me is probably the best thing.
Next is questioning. And when you're asking questions, you want to make sure they are relevant to the topic and make statements to clarify what the speaker is saying. So
rephrase it.
Yeah.
And in the way that you would put it and hand it back to them.
Which is the next point, reflection, which is closely repeating or rephrasing, because that reinforces the message and it demonstrates that you understand it.
Well, and that's also a way to elicit things from them that are subtle that they missed when they were communicating it.
Or that you didn't pick up on because it wasn't emphasized enough. It can show what you understand from the message and then give them the opportunity to say, yes, and this is the other important thing, which goes along with clarification, our next one, and that is asking questions specifically to understand the message.
Yeah, and these questions really shouldn't be yes/no type things. When you're talking with somebody, ask open-ended questions so that they can further explain, and that will help you actually get what's going on and get it back and forth established instead of it being just a binary, quick win. I mean, this is why they ask those kind of questions in interviews, is to elicit this information from people.
And finally is summarization. This is different from reflection. Reflection is repeating or paraphrasing a specific point, and summarization is taking the main points from a conversation or a talk and reiterating them in a logical and clear way, or putting them in your own terms. So for me, I would take a talk and outline it, and then go back and summarize by going over the key points that I outlined. And what this does is it allows the speaker the chance to, one, correct any mistakes that you had, if you misunderstood them or if they weren't clear in what they said. It also allows them, same with reflection, to emphasize the important points.
And let me explain another thing too that I use in summarization. when I'm having a conversation with people, especially like in a small meeting, is at the end of it, go, okay, here's what I got for action items. Because you think about it, that's going to come out of the summarization of that conversation anyway. But it's not you just reiterating, it's what do we do now?
That's a very good point. That's really good for
it's a way to sneak it in there.
Yeah, that's great. Some signs of active listening include smiling
when appropriate.
Yes, when appropriate.
And don't do the like big fake smile.
No, if you can't give a genuine smile, don't smile.
Yeah.
Eye contact, your posture. Active listening is kind of leaning in, focusing on the speaker, not just looking at them, but positioning your body to be angled towards them.
Yeah. And also mirroring their posture helps a lot. For whatever reason, we tend to be more sympathetic to people that are in the same posture that we're in, and it goes in both directions.
Yes.
So it's almost like you bring your mental states closer together. It's a very strange psychological thing that is very true, but we really don't know why.
The other thing is remove distractions. And something I've done in a few interviews is as I'm walking in, I have my phone out and I'm turning it off.
Yeah.
And it's very obvious I'm turning my phone off. This can also be when you walk into a meeting, or I've known people who would have everyone in the family turn their phone off at the dinner table for the time that they were there.
Yeah, and we had an issue with that at work. You know, we had an email go around, and it was because people were opening their cell phones up, or not opening their cell phones, they're getting their cell phone out during meetings and texting people and looking down. And, you know, what kind of message does that send to your employer? What kind of message does that send to the client? It's not a good one.
Yes.
And so, yeah, getting that distraction out of the room, you know, sitting there doodling, it's the same kind of thing. Like you
and I think
really
some
don't
of
wanna
this
do
has
that.
to do with sort of a generational thing, and I don't want to like attack the younger generation, the millennials. But
well,
it
millennials, you know, like I don't want to attack them either, but they're very intolerant of people wasting their time, and they're gonna find something to do. And as an employer, you need to really look around and go, okay, they're bored and they're not getting anything out of this meeting. Why is that? Like, am I not presenting it well? Do I have the wrong people in the meeting? You know, so there's a back and forth. Yes, they don't need to be rude, but on the other hand, if they are being rude, that's evidence of something that you can control.
Well, what I was getting at is, to them, it's not rude.
Right.
They don't perceive it as something that is rude. And I have spoken with some that, you know, I was like, hey, that's not cool. And like, what do you mean?
Yeah, I've had that same conversation. And, you know, I mean, the thing is to some degree, you can't control other people's behavior.
No, you can't. But it's another thing that
it does ruin your perception. If you're the person opening the phone up and messing around during a meeting, you need to realize there's a pretty heavy cost in the way other people perceive you when you're doing that. And so, and it does come across as rude. You may not intend it that way.
I've also seen...
of course, the other thing is, too, I've seen loads of people that are definitely not millennials because their, you know, grandchildren are millennials doing the same thing. So
Yeah.
This is not, it's not a generational thing. It's somewhat of a lack of respect, and it's a lack of being aware of the people that are around you. And this is not something you want to do when you're trying to actively listen to someone.
Well, yeah, I mean, because it is a distraction, but also it's just what I've noticed, and when I've talked to people about it, a lot of the people younger than me that I've talked to about it did not perceive it as being rude. To them, it was just a natural, normal thing. And when explained, hey, that's actually kind of, it's perceived as being rude in this setting, they're like, I didn't even think of that. And, you know, they're like, thanks for, you know, being nice and pointing that out.
Yeah. Well,
Most of them.
I mean, you'll see it with older folks too. I mean, that's...
I will say though, I did have one boss that was great about it because he played into it. Of course, I had told him up front myself. I'm like, I take notes on my phone. I started bringing a notepad into our meetings so that I wouldn't have to do that.
That's why I like paper.
Yeah,
For
but
that reason.
there were times that he asked me to get my phone out and look something up in the meeting as part of it. And I was like, this is how you handle that situation as the speaker. You know people are going to get their phone out and want to look something up that you mentioned, so ask them to.
Yeah. And that's effectively the speaker listening to his audience.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some hindrances to effective listening, because I know we're kind of running down on time.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about people formulating replies while they're listening.
Yes.
And this is something I've noticed. I think everybody notices this at some point. The biggest one for me is paying attention to more than one conversation at a time. My morning meeting, every morning, there's a couple of people that talk over each other and talk across the room to somebody else. And so there's multiple conversations going on, and I can't hear any of it. And it's extremely distracting. Now, this also includes things like TV and radio.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up one of our favorite series here, though, on this point, which is the Sword of Truth. In the prequel novella, Dead of Bones, it has Zed as the first wizard, and he's listening to like 12 conversations at once and replying to each of them. It's like the exact opposite of you in that situation.
Yeah. Well, I really legitimately can't. Like, if the radio or the TV is on and that racket's going on, like, my wife and I will drive down the road and she'll be talking to me about something and I turn the radio down because I can't process it.
Well, most people cannot listen to, I would say almost all people cannot listen to multiple conversations. You may think you can, but you're not really paying attention to either or any of them.
The thing is, if they're light conversations and they don't really matter,
then you're not really listening.
Yeah, you can pick up the ambient sound, but the instant you focus on one, the second one becomes background noise that's distracting.
Yes.
Because I can remember sitting and having some goofy conversation, I think with you at college, and some lady behind us couldn't pronounce futon, and she was pronouncing it photon. So apparently she sleeps on a photon. Do you not remember that conversation?
I remember that.
And I just about fell out in the middle of a conversation that was not funny because I heard that. And
this could also be trying to have a conversation with someone in the room with you and being on the phone.
Yes, and that's extremely discourteous.
Unless it's like you're trying to figure out where you're going out to eat or where to meet or something like that. That in particular circumstances that makes sense. But when you and I are having one conversation and I'm trying to have another conversation on the phone, that's separate and not like including you in that.
Well, somebody's being rude, right? Like the person talking to the person on the phone is being rude, or the person on the phone that won't hang up the phone and talk to the person, or the person on the other end of the line who knows it. Like somebody knows that their conversation is a lower priority and they should move off so that the priority conversation can happen.
And then there's also environmental noises. Yeah. Like a noisy bar is not good for deep discussions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know we've had our quarterly, meeting about the podcast at Buffalo Wild Wings.
Yeah.
And there was a ball game going on or something. And
it was just bad timing on our part.
It was awful because like you'd write something and you're like holding it up. I mean, you're getting to the point where it's like you can't hear and you're 3 feet away from each other and somebody 40 feet away is making so much noise.
No.
Over their terrible ball team.
Another hindrance is when you find the communicator attractive or unattractive.
Yeah. Well, it's a distraction.
No.
And it tends to put it's almost an inbuilt prejudice.
And you see this a lot in sales where they will get
I've seen people not listen to the sales girl, for instance, when she's very attractive because they're just like, and they treat them like they're stupid.
They either treat them like they're stupid, but they also tend to buy more from attractive people.
Yeah.
Without realizing it. The two problems you come across here in this particular distraction is you're either fantasizing about the speaker or you're mentally arguing with them because something about them you don't like.
Yeah, well, and I'll give you an example. We have a friend who works with someone that they very strongly dislike, and they, some of it is actual disagreement, but a lot of it is this person reminds the friend of their little sister who's a pain in the butt, and that preconceived notion. So I don't even know that it's necessarily attractiveness. Like if someone reminds you of someone that you really detest,
That's what I said. It's attractive or unattractive. And this could be not I find you physically unattractive, but
mentally
unattractive.
Mentally or physically or emotionally, or you just, like something's off.
Actually, when I first wrote this, these were two separate points, and I put them together because it's pretty much the same thing. Yeah,
and that's, I guess like the way it's written, because I knew what you meant when you were saying attractive, unattractive, but it's more of you are letting your emotions color things without the actual input that you need for those emotions to be valid.
Exactly. Yes. And
attractiveness and unattractiveness tends to be one of the main areas that we do that, but it's not the only one.
Well, yeah. The next is you're not focused or you're not interested. You could be preoccupied with things going on in your own life. I know when I was going through my divorce, I was also trying to take my boards for med school.
Yeah.
And I got the divorce papers 2 days before I was scheduled to take my boards.
Yeah, and that pretty much screwed you on that. And yeah, so like when you're in another place emotionally, it's very difficult to be focused and interested in the conversation that's actually happening in front of you, or being preoccupied. Like, it may not be something even emotional. It's like, hey, look, I've got this other thing I've got to get done, or I'm obsessed with for whatever reason, and this thing is a distraction from it.
Or if you're feeling ill or tired. Like a good example of this is earlier today, you and I were having an email conversation with a potential guest we may have on the show.
Fairly soon.
Yeah, and she wrote to us. She's like, hey, I'm going home early. I'm not feeling well. And it was basically, hey, I'm not feeling well. I'm not really able to give you guys my full attention on this conversation. Great on her part.
Yeah. Because I can't count how many meetings I've walked into with just an absolute raging headache or, being really tired. I've had a lot of trouble with that lately, lack of sleep wise. And it really makes it hard to retain information, and it's hard to be emotionally patient with people. Like basically all the stuff that's on the list, those things make harder.
Yes. Finally, having preconceived ideas. We kind of touched on this a little bit in some of the other ones, but prejudice or bias or previous experience.
Yeah.
You've been through this before, and you have this is what happened the last time, and you just have this is going to be the same
never
way.
Again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, the other thing too is that's also called learning.
Yeah. And then not empathizing. There's a couple of different things that look like empathizing but aren't, such as sympathizing, which is feeling sorry for the experiences of someone else instead of putting yourself in their shoes. It's almost like looking. Yeah, it's not how would I feel in that position. It's looking down on them.
Well, I'll give you an example. I deal with quite a few people who grew up in the upper middle class suburbanite bubble. And when they talk about people that are poor, one thing I've noticed is a substantial fraction of them will say, oh, they're so poor, they can't do this, they can't do that. They don't, it's very clear in their verbiage that they're not coming from a place of, okay, how would I feel if I was poor like that? They're coming from a place of, oh, they can't do it because they're poor, whatever it happens to be, not, okay, here's why they won't do it, or here's why they're having trouble.
Well, see, that leads right into the last one here, which is, identifying and not empathizing, which identifying is understanding. They have the cognitive, they can't do this because they're poor, but they don't put themselves in those shoes and go, how would I respond to being in this situation?
Yeah, well, and then how are you going to help somebody?
Yeah.
Like legitimately, a good half of getting out of a lot of problems is being able to emotionally cope with whatever it takes to do it.
No.
That there's some things that, it's legitimately not possible, but there's a whole lot of things that it is possible, but you're in a state where you can't do it. And the person that is trying to guide you out of it, if they only understand your state intellectually, they can't get you past the emotional part.
It's very true. So that pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, we're talking about listening, right? And I kind of like to tie the tricks of the trade to sort of our topic at hand. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you write services, things that another app is calling, like over the wire especially, but, with API calls. And this ties right back into our listening stuff as well. There's a general rule in these kind of things that you are very tolerant of what you receive. In other words, the service doesn't fall over and die or send out bad output because it got bad input or got weird input that it wasn't expecting. And that when you do send out output, that you send out very well structured, very clean output. You'll notice that this is very analogous to what you have to do in active listening. You have to put up with opinions you don't like. You have to put up with things being said that you don't like, things that make you feel emotionally awkward without falling over. And yet, to be an effective communicator, you also have to not send out things that cause the other person to fall over. So when you're building a service, it's the same principle applied electronically. You structure things in such a way that the communication channel does not become a problem. In other words, where you are being very accepting of input and very careful with your output. This is how you write a service that is a good listener. You notice this ties right into communication because it's modeled off of human communication. So the same underlying principles apply. Just want to throw that out there as something for people to kind of think about as you're designing things. So that's what I got. If you have a question or comment for us, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed under Creative Commons. The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up to our email list, be sure and check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with the news about the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time.